Hello friends, I'm a man from the internet, and welcome back to Obscure and Forgotten PS1 Games, volume number 14 to be exact, which is now sponsored by Haji Bey's Handmade Turkish Delight. Haji Bey doesn't know they're the sponsor for this episode, but a drunk fella in a pub said he'd pay me 20 quid if I gave the Turkish Delight he was eating a shout out in the next episode, and look, I'm a man of my word, so yeah. Thanks for the €20, Carl. Anyway, fan selection rules are still in effect, so each of the 4 games we'll be looking at today will have been chosen by you, the lovely viewer, assuming they're picked by our old pal the wheel, that is. So let's not waste any more time. I know you're all hungry for some games, so sit back, relax, and let the wheel provide.
You will provide.
Kicking things off today, we have the token racing game for this volume, and it's Maniacs, a spin-off of the much-loved Micro Machines series, and like all Micro Machines games, this of course comes from our UK friends at Codemasters in what is a pretty late release for the console, making its way to PAL regions in April 2000 before appearing in North America a little later in the year, now under the name foxkids.com, Maniacs Racing, which yes, is the actual official title. This game was chosen for us today by Kaisar Cantu, and look, anybody who wants to pick a Micro Machines title is a friend of mine, so congrats on the win. Now, I don't know if this was the case across the globe, but Micro Machines video games always felt like a pretty big deal over here in the UK and Ireland, well, at least it did during the early to mid 90s. If you knew somebody with a Sega Mega Drive, there was a good chance they owned at least one Micro Machines game, since it was pretty much the de facto multiplayer game of its time, in no part thanks to Codemasters' genius J-Card, which enabled you to connect 2 additional controllers to your console via the game cartridge itself. This not only made 4-player gameplay easier than ever, but Codemasters went one step further, allowing up to 8 players to play simultaneously as long as 2 players shared a controller. It was really dumb, but also incredibly fun. The series peak is usually considered the duo of Mega Drive games, Micro Machines 96 and Micro Machines Military, and while these games were published by Codemasters, they were actually developed by a team called Supersonic Software, and after their work on 98 and Military, Supersonic Software then decided to work on their own racing games away from Codemasters and the Micro Machines brand. And the first of these was a game called Supersonic Racers, a game we actually looked at all the way back in the very first volume of this series, and if you can believe it, the game is basically just Micro Machines again, only weirder and not micro, I guess. Anyway, without Supersonic Software at the helm, the PS1 era of Micro Machines was now being handled by Codemasters themselves, and while this era certainly wasn't as bountiful when it came to Micro Machines games, Codemasters' first entry on the console, 97's Micro Machines V3, is arguably one of the best in the series, and also my personal favourite. A bright, colourful game full of cute little vehicles and incredibly hazardous tracks to race around. It even has the 8-player functionality too, well, as long as you've got a multi-tap or two. Unfortunately, putting controller ports into a disc is a little bit excessive, and also impossible. So for a time, V3 was the only Micro Machines game we had until the year 2000, when we were graced with Maniacs, a spin-off that is still very much a Micro Machines game, just without the machine part. This time around, we're racing around the tracks with shrunk down little guys and gals, all willing volunteers of a mad scientist's plan to solve the planet's sustainability problems. Basically, if the population of the globe was shrunk down in size to be much smaller, it wouldn't need to consume as much resources. So yeah, let's see if shrinking people is actually a viable option. All these little racers you see here are more or less running tests to see how they would handle the whole process. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I'm actually surprised this game even has a plot, and I personally would have been fine if they just went, alright, here's little dudes running around a kitchen, enjoy your game, but hey, kudos for putting in the effort, I suppose. Now, before we get into the game's modes, I think it's important we clarify how Maniacs plays, and more importantly, what sets it apart from other games in the series. Now, at its core, this is your standard top-down racer. They aren't really all that popular nowadays, but if you're above the age of 25, you probably played at least one of these in your life. You basically hold the accelerator and just rotate your vehicle in the direction of the track. I once heard somebody refer to them as tank control racers, and you know what? That actually isn't too far off. Now, when it comes to Maniacs, the game continues this tradition of control. You hold X to accelerate, square to brake, and you use the D-pad to turn. It's exactly what you'd expect. But one major difference this time around is that if you're playing with an analog controller, you can actually move entirely using the left stick, which instead makes this game feel a bit more like a platforming racing game. And honestly, to me, this feels like the intended way to play this game. The big gimmick here is obviously to swap from vehicles to people, and I'm glad Codemasters adapted the control to reflect this change in movement. It's a lot more precise, you can jump to get over obstacles and gaps. It's basically Micro Machines, but if it was now a platforming racing hybrid, and you know what? That's actually quite cool. Although one thing I was worried about was how this change would affect the game's variety, and what I mean by this is that Micro Machines games usually have a ton of different vehicles, all of which feature differing speeds and handling models that can drastically change how the racing feels from course to course. Whereas if you're playing as these guys, would it not just all feel the same? Well, the good news is that this is not the case, as your racer's speed and handling also changes drastically depending on the surface that they're running on. Whether it's kitchen counters, carpets, ice, or a Scalextrics track, almost everything here can have an effect on your movement, and it can often require you to adjust your racing style across specific segments or even entire tracks. It's a very clever way to keep that race variety intact, but also make it thematically consistent with your new racers, which is a nice touch really. Although that being said, they still do manage to throw in a few vehicle levels as well to spice things up from time to time. The skateboard track in particular is a lot of fun, as it requires you to use your momentum on pipes to make it over gaps throughout the track, and not only does this work, it actually feels better than it probably has any right to. So as you can see, the racing is still pure Micro Machines, only different. But another change beyond the controls are the characters themselves. In past games, your character choice didn't really have much of an effect outside of your vehicle's color, whereas in Maniacs, your choice of Maniac plays a much bigger role. You see, traditionally, Micro Machines games would often feature weapons, but only on specific vehicles or as item pickups along the track. In this game, however, each character has access to 2 different character skills, which can be activated using the shoulder buttons. To use these abilities, you need to collect orbs on the track. You can hold up to 4 orbs at a time, and the more that you're holding, the stronger your abilities will be when you activate them. Your abilities, of course, cover things like offensive and defensive attacks, as well as speed buffs, and let me tell you, careful usage of these skills is mandatory if you want to succeed in this game, because getting hit by a high-powered ability can make or break a race in an instant. Personally, I found characters like Vortex, who had access to powerful defensive abilities like these black hole mines, which absolutely obliterate enemies trailing behind you, were the most useful in this game. But if you prefer more aggressive options or weird abilities, there's a character for pretty much every playstyle here. And speaking of the characters, the designs here are certainly something. I'm not 100% sure if I think they're very good, but they are certainly quite memorable and rather extreme in some cases. I suppose that's what being an official FoxKids.com game does to you. We only want the coolest shit, like Roach Boy and Lightbulb Man. Anyway, I think it's about time we moved on to the modes, and as you'd expect, there's plenty here to sink your teeth into. We've of course got the usual multiplayer options, including 8-player multiplayer and team modes, and there's plenty of time trial challenges to keep you busy across the game's 40 plus tracks. But of course, the star of the show is the game's challenge mode, which is where you'll spend most of your time racing across the game's various tracks in the hope of unlocking new characters, even more tracks, and some very fun cheat modes and extras. The format here is pretty straightforward. You select from one of our characters and take them across 10 different races, all separated by different tiers. Once you make it past the warm-up training track, you then get to pick one of 4 different races in each tier. Beat the course of your choosing, and then you move up to the next tier and pick another race, rinse and repeat until you reach the very end. Now during this mode, you only have a set number of lives to reach the end. The minimum position you need to achieve to complete a race is second place unless you're in the final tier, in which case first is the only option to proceed. You can at least earn a few more lives if you're very good and manage to win 3 races in a row, which will then bring you to a bonus stage where you gotta collect a number of orbs before time runs out. And honestly, in this game, each life really does make a difference, because some of these races can be pretty damn tough. Challenge mode is also where your characters can receive upgrades to their abilities, which are permanent and transfer over to other modes too. So if you're a completionist, you're going to want to play through the challenge mode at least once with every character, not just for their enhanced abilities, but for their endings too, which are usually quite short and kinda goofy, but I appreciate the inclusion all the same. Of course though, we all know the real prizes here are the unlockable characters and tracks, which you can only get by achieving first place across every track in a tier, meaning to unlock everything, it'll require a minimum of 4 perfect playthroughs, which, unless you're very good, will probably take most people a little longer than 4 playthroughs to achieve. But on the bright side, once you've beaten all 4 final tracks in the game, it then lets you pick tracks in any order going forward. So if there's a few second place finishes you need to rectify, it at least stops you wasting too much time to do so. Another nice touch are the bonus cheat modes you can unlock as well, which includes a lot of the usual stuff you'd expect and some weirder features like Aussie mode, which lets you play the game upside down. I'm not sure why you would do this, but it is pretty funny. So as you can see, Maniacs is a pretty feature-rich game, all things considered. It's certainly not the most fleshed out game in the series by any means, but for a 2000 era PS1 racer, you're certainly gonna get your money's worth with this one. Although that being said, how are things on the presentation and performance side? Well, first off, I'd like to mention that in this case, I actually opted to play the PAL version of this game, no shade to foxkids.com, which, if you're wondering, the only real difference content-wise between the two versions is the inclusion of a brief Fox Kids movie in the opening, but the NTSC version does also attempt to run at 30 FPS, but the keyword here is attempt. I noticed quite a lot of frame drops and the often bout of jitteriness while playing the North American version, and sure enough, swapping over to the PAL original gave me a stable 25 FPS with no noticeable drops anywhere. Now that's not to say that the North American version is bad or unplayable by any means, it's just that when given the choice, the more stable PAL version feels like the better of the two in my humble opinion. Now looks wise, the game doesn't necessarily give off the best first impression. Some of the animated scenes and menus feel very low budget and I don't know, just kinda bland in parts, especially compared to V3, which is just cool menus the game. But once you actually get into the gameplay and see the racetracks in motion, it becomes quite clear that this is actually a very good looking PlayStation game, much better than I remember it looking actually. The levels still feature you racing around various real world locations like kitchens, bathrooms, bedrooms, gardens, and a whole lot of other places bigger humans would normally hang out in, but the attention to detail and density of the objects in some of these locales is really quite impressive. They actually feel properly lived in and believable to an extent. The game also has a kind of darker and I don't know, edgier vibe to everything compared to the brighter, more playful Micro Machines games of the past, but they still manage to maintain that distinct Micro Machines charm and identity. Honestly, it's the tracks and all the cool stuff within them that really steal the show in this game. In particular, my favorite part of any Micro Machines game are the cool level-specific gimmicks that usually bundle all the characters together or transport you to different parts of the level in strange and unique ways. And this entry probably has my favorite of any game in the series, where mid-race you get sucked into an old games console and the gameplay then swaps to this retro spaceship game where you and your opponents have to navigate your way to the top, avoiding these asteroids in the process. It is pure micro machines and perfectly captures that essence of fun and creativity that the series has always excelled at. Well, it's either that part or driving into a toilet to progress in the race, but both are quite fun to be fair. The character designs, as we already mentioned, are quite odd and unfortunately don't necessarily hold up all that well during the races, at least when viewed up close, but they are thankfully quite distinct from one another and easy to differentiate in the middle of a race, which, let's be fair, is all you want really. The sound also takes quite a shift for the series too. Now, while I like the sound effects in this game, if you've played a lot of video games, you might notice that some of them come from a collection used by many devs back in the day. In particular, this game shares quite a few of its sound effects with the game Croc, which resulted in me having Croc flashbacks multiple times per race, which is nice but also distracting if you're trying to win. The soundtrack, however, was pretty interesting. It featured some very nice Euro-tinged electronic tracks, which I wasn't all that enamored by initially, but really began to grow on me as I played through the game. The tempo was a little lower than what I'd expect from a noughties PS1 Euro racer, and while I wouldn't exactly classify them as bangers, they are most certainly quite catchy, and there's a lot of them too, so it's all good in my book. Also, there's at least one or two tracks that sound like they'd fit right into a Crash Bandicoot game. The resemblance is uncanny. So that begs the question, is Micromaniacs a game worth playing nowadays? And personally, I'd say yeah, 100%, although only if you're a Micro Machines fan. I'm well aware this style of racer is an acquired taste, and if you've never really been a fan of top-down racers, well, this one certainly won't change your mind. It still features the same old issues relating to your narrow field of view, which you also can't change in this game, by the way, so it does mean you're gonna have to rely on track knowledge to succeed from time to time, not to mention the AI in this game can be very unforgiving, and in the game's tougher tracks, well, it certainly has the potential to push those with shorter tempers a little over the edge, but at the end of the day, if you're a Micro Machines fan, this is a spin-off that I think stands with the best the series has to offer, and with its unique style of movement and slightly weirder and edgier style, it also manages to stand out in the series as well, making it one of, if not the most unique of all the Micro Machines games. So, needless to say, if you're a fan of the series and have skipped out on this entry, I'd absolutely recommend tracking it down. It's full of single-player content, it's great for multiplayer, and it's also quite cheap to buy these days as well, so if you need to purchase the game to include alongside your cats for B-roll, it is thankfully one that won't break the bank. Seriously, at this stage I think I'm just buying physical games to have an excuse to include the cats in videos more, but you know, it's money well spent I think. But hey, it also helps when the games are fun too, so yeah, it's a win-win really.
You will provide.
Next up, we have the weird and wonderful Tecmo's Deception Invitation to Darkness, aka Devil's Deception in PAL regions, aka Kokumekan Trap Simulation Game over in Japan. And if we piece all these names together, we can probably figure out that we've got ourselves a trap simulation game from Tecmo, one that probably also features the devil a fair bit, and yes, it most certainly does. Now, this game was chosen for the wheel by a whopping and record-breaking 4 people, so give it up for Ene Kororo, Julius Engels Greer III, Mr. Becker, and now 2-time winner Mako Powered Gaming. So, as you can see, quite the popular pick. Now, this is actually the first time we've looked at a Tecmo game on the channel, a name you're probably familiar with thanks to the much-loved Ninja Gaiden and Dead or Alive series of games, and also that spooky game where you take pictures of ghosts. Nowadays, Tecmo, like many Japanese companies, have been fused into another Japanese game company to form Koei Tecmo, who are thankfully still trucking along, even if their games have been a little hit or miss these days. But never you mind all that modern stuff, because today we're going to travel back in time to 1996 to look at one of Tecmo's strangest and also most enduring series, Deception, a series that I often like to describe as Home Alone, but for goths. The idea is that you set up a bunch of traps inside your evil lair to creatively murder or capture any would-be heroes that happen to wander into it. Not only is it a very funny and creative concept for a video game, but it's one that has managed to spawn 6 different entries across multiple different console generations, the most recent of which appearing on the PS4 and Vita. So even though the series is certainly rather niche and obscure, it's managed to stay relevant and, more importantly, alive. Well, kinda. It has been 8 years since the last one, but let's forget about that for now, because it's time to look at the original Deception, the game that started it all, and in some ways is also kind of the black sheep of the series as well. We'll talk more about that later, but for now, let's get the core concepts of the gameplay out of the way. Deception, as mentioned, is a game all about setting traps. Enemies will wander into your lair, you then place traps around the lair using a handy map screen, and then from a first-person perspective you wander around said lair, luring your enemies into these traps, and once an enemy appears within range of a trap, you tap the circle button, and then you watch as they get killed or maimed in the most hilarious and cartoonish ways imaginable. Now, it's worth noting that your player character has no immediate way of engaging with or attacking these enemies outside of your traps, but the enemies, they most certainly can attack you. So you can expect to be doing plenty of dodging and sidestepping, but if you've played any early console FPS game, you should be able to handle this like a pro, no problem. And yeah, that's kind of the basic gist of things really. The core gameplay loop is lay trap, lure enemy, and then bam, right in the pit. But of course, that's just the basics, because beneath it all, Deception is actually a pretty fully featured game with quite a lot of systems to play around with if you want to get the most out of it, like redesigning your lair for maximum trap efficiency, or collecting enough corpses to summon a giant eyeball that crushes your enemies using gravity powers. Oh yeah, that's the good stuff. But before we talk about these additional features and systems, let's talk a bit about why we're doing all this in the first place, and the short answer is the old classic betrayal. So Deception takes place in a medieval fantasy setting where you play as the eldest prince of the land of Zemeckis, who is player named by the way, so I guess this prince is just called Sean. Well, after our prince returns home and announces his engagement to Princess Fiona from the neighboring kingdom of Angelo, the king is suddenly murdered by a mysterious floating sword. A sword that just happens to belong to you. Of course, your brother, who is second in line to the throne by the way, just so happens to appear and blame everything on you, and well, there you go, you're getting burnt on the stake. Clearly something seems a little bit fishy, and let me tell you, we ain't happy about it, so we call out to anybody for help, be it God or even the devil himself, and guess who just so happened to answer? Well, it wasn't God, I can tell you that much. So, long story short, you survive this horrible ordeal, but in return you become a son of darkness and end up the caretaker of a place known as the Castle of the Damned, where you and your sexy demon friend are now working towards resurrecting the devil by collecting 6 legendary evil items. Now honestly, to my surprise, the story, as goofy as it can be at times, really ended up being one of Deception's strongest parts in my opinion, and while I'll avoid talking about it too much to avoid spoilers, we will revisit it a little bit later, you know, after we see some more funny trap-related deaths. So once we begin, the game takes us through various different story chapters, 27 of them to be exact, and in these chapters, the goal is usually to kill or capture whoever invades the castle. Sometimes it might just be one invader, sometimes it might be 12 invaders, but either way, the castle only allows for a maximum of 4 invaders to be active at one time, 2 assigned to the bottom floor of the castle and 2 assigned to the top floor of the castle. So in other words, you'll only ever have to deal with a maximum of 2 enemies at one time. Now this is probably down to engine limitations, but it still feels balanced enough all the same. The castle itself and its layout are something you'll become very familiar with as the game goes along. While it does have a number of set rooms and locations that are important to gameplay and progression, like the prisons, teleporters, power rooms, and most importantly the demon gate, which is kind of like your home base in the castle, the game also allows you to add on to your castle by building new rooms and hallways to create both new paths and shortcuts for yourself, but also to devise clever ways to funnel enemies in for easy trap usage. Now I'm not gonna lie, I didn't really use the building functionality all that much because my basic strategy throughout this game was to utilize the 2 largest rooms in the house as a sort of trap paradise, those being the entrance hall downstairs and the slightly less big hall upstairs, which conveniently is also where invaders happen to spawn a good 90% of the time. So yeah, the building feature, while probably useful to some people, is completely avoidable if you're incredibly uncreative like I am. Now movement, as you might have guessed, is essentially the same as any early first-person title on the PlayStation, which is to say if you're used to FPS D-pad controls, the game actually feels pretty nice to play, all things considered, as long as you're competent with using shoulder buttons to strafe. Navigating the castle and all its weird secret doors and teleporters is a breeze. Of course, that's once you get used to the castle layout itself, which at first can feel a little large and overwhelming, but believe me, you will quickly grow accustomed to it. It also helps that you can pull up a handy map at any time to check your position, and even utilize this flyby camera too if you're really lost. Now when it comes to traps, executing them on enemies is one thing, but how do we actually place them? Well, to do that, we'll need to access this menu, which appears before we start a level and can also be accessed mid-game if you wander over to the demon gate or any of the power generators on the map. This means traps can't be laid while you're in first-person mode, and if you run out of them mid-level, well, you're going to need to run back to one of these locations to restock and place them all over again. Now traps, they come in all shapes and sizes. There's traps that can damage enemies, traps that can confuse and disorientate enemies, and also traps that can capture enemies, which is quite important. We'll talk more about capture traps in a moment, but for now, let's focus on the damage traps. Each trap is split into one of 2 different damage types, physical or magic. Every invader has their own strengths and weaknesses when it comes to these traps, and thankfully you can easily view these in the map screen before you pick and lay your trap. So naturally, if any enemy is weak to magic, well then you use a magic trap. If they're weak to physical, you use a physical trap. Although even when taking these weaknesses into consideration, traps don't always have a 100% success rate, and enemies do have the ability to dodge and avoid traps if their stats are high enough. So studying the enemies before you purchase your traps is the key to success really. Traps can be placed on walls, some will attack from below while some will attack from above, and generally the more damage a trap does, the smaller its chance is at success. But as the game progresses, you will begin to unlock more powerful and expensive traps, and even gain the ability to upgrade them as well, something which is mandatory for the game's tougher invaders. Now, purchasing traps requires you to use a resource called MP. The more powerful the trap, the more expensive its MP cost. MP is something that can be earned through item drops from enemies, but crucially, you'll get most of your MP from bonuses received at the end of a chapter. Depending on how quickly you beat the level, how much damage you took during it, and how many traps you used successfully, you'll get bonus MP rewards for each, and when you consider the additional bonuses for killing or capturing all enemies in a level, it can pay big time to go in with a set game plan from the beginning. And let me tell you, I learned quite quickly, if you play this game well, MP is a resource that is very plentiful throughout the campaign. So long story short, never be afraid to use as many traps as you want, even the powerful ones. Don't you worry, you've got plenty of MP to spare, so you go right ahead, treat yourself to the odd giant flaming foot from time to time. You deserve it. Now let's say you don't want to kill your enemies. Well, you do have the option to capture them instead, and the process to do this actually works quite similarly to Pokemon, if you can believe. If you damage your opponents, they become easier to capture. Hit them with a few damage traps and then drop a big cage on them or suck them into a wall or something. Once they're locked in by the trap, if you then go up to them and drain this meter before they escape, you've successfully captured them, and from there, you can either use their soul for MP or kill them and steal their gold. Gold is another resource, by the way, and is probably a bit more important than MP because it's both less plentiful throughout the game and is also the resource needed to upgrade your traps. So yeah, generally when given the option between MP and gold, you should probably pick the gold. But hold up, later in the game you also gain a new option, which is to lock your captives in prison, and if you capture enough of a certain enemy type, you can then use their bodies to create monsters, which are very powerful attacks that you can summon at any time, even while in first person mode. Well, assuming you have enough block crystals, that is, which are another thing you might want to save your gold for and can be bought from in-game merchants who you then promptly capture afterwards to make even more monsters. Yeah, this game is wild. So as you can see, Deception really does have quite a lot going on. It's honestly quite a simple and straightforward game to play, but there's so many additional things it makes you think about. Do I want to kill everybody for a genocide bonus? Do I need to capture an additional gem guardian so I can summon a big red dragon? Do I want to let my zombie get this kill instead of me so it gets the experience instead and upgrades into a ghoul? Or do I need that experience because I need to get tankier and avoid getting blown up by these wizards? The game even gives you an opportunity at the end of most chapters to do something called body collecting, where you can try lure previously defeated enemies to your castle to try stock up on some extra XP or additional bodies. And better still, sometimes luring specific combinations of enemies can result in bonus enemies appearing alongside them, like a witch or even an alien. This is the only way to make these enemies appear, by the way, and they are needed for some of the game's tougher monsters, so it definitely pays to take advantage of body collecting whenever you can, and believe me, I took advantage of it many times. In fact, by the end of the game, I was so incredibly wealthy, over-leveled, and packed with the game's most ridiculous monsters that it was basically a power fantasy at this stage. Although, to be honest, Deception never really felt like a game where you're ever in too much danger or even challenged all that much. Enemy AI is very dumb and simplistic, and despite the large number of enemy types, their general strategy is to either walk right at you and attack with a melee weapon, or to walk right at you and stop on occasion to shoot a projectile, and as long as you're good at sidestepping, well, that's about as difficult as the game's gonna get. It's really more of an endurance and luck trial than anything. Lure your enemy into a trap, try to get it as close to the middle as possible, and then cross your fingers and hope it all works out. If it does, great. If not, well, just lay a few more and try again. It unfortunately can make the game feel a little slow-paced at times, since the game only allows you to activate one trap at a time, but even so, there's still something so incredibly enjoyable about getting a trap to work perfectly. Like, you think in the 10+ hours I spent playing this game that I get tired of dropping enemies into a pit, or crushing them with a foot, or splatting them into the ceiling, or blowing them up with a bomb, but honestly, I never did. It can get tedious in between, sure, especially if you're doing all the body collecting missions and trying to get all the monsters, but it's almost always worth it for the eventual payoff, you know? Not many games let you kill people in such dramatic and hilarious fashion, and considering this is a PS1 game from 1996, it still manages to be quite appealing all these years later, even in spite of its simplicity. But as mentioned before, the story was another part that managed to keep me entertained throughout, as early on, it's revealed your brother has now taken your place on the throne, and in the process also stolen your fiancée Fiona as well, which, as you'd imagine, only makes your thirst for revenge grow even stronger. A lot of the game is just seeing your brother smugly send people to try kill you, only for him to grow increasingly more panicked and paranoid as nobody returns from the job, probably because I was too busy rotating them at speed for my own enjoyment. But the game also follows your descent into evil and how you end up murdering even the truly good people who wander into your castle, including a family who are searching for a way to cure their ill daughter, in what is probably one of the darkest things I have ever seen in a PlayStation game. I mean, the process of killing them is still funny, but, you know, the aftermath, most certainly isn't. There's plenty of twists and turns as the game goes on, and while it definitely doesn't feature the highest grade video game writing and storytelling you'll ever see, it most certainly is different and will hold your attention throughout. And there's even multiple endings you can get as well, which are tied to one not so obvious part of the game and two very obvious parts of the game, which is to say you either pick option A or B. So there is some replayability here, although personally I think most people will get to see and experience more or less everything the game has to offer in just one playthrough. And I suppose before we finish up, we should talk a little bit about the presentation, which I gotta say is really quite good considering that this is a rather early release on the platform. The textures and character models clearly aren't the most polished out there, but I think they match and complement the dark and gothic vibe of the game, and as far as the spooky castle interiors go, they pretty much nailed it really. The traps and their activations look great with multiple different animations for each, and there are even some really cool visual effects like this infinite mirror, which we love to see. The game also runs at a mostly stable 30 FPS, only dropping on occasion when two enemies and a lot of traps are active in the one location, but credit where credit is due. For a 96 title, it both runs and looks pretty great. As for the sound and music, I think their implementation in this title is quite impressive. The game allows you to track enemies in other rooms by sound, which is really quite accurate to their position in the map, and some of the sound effects on the traps and enemy attacks are really quite satisfying as well. The music, however, is a little bit more subtle, at times giving us some very sinister and ambient vibes throughout the game, which, let's be honest, is perfect for a game like this, but it will still surprise you with some pretty catchy beats at times as well. Now don't get me wrong, the game always sounds rather evil, but that doesn't mean you can't bop your head along while being evil, you know? Well, that's about it for Deception, an incredibly unique and interesting concept that mostly succeeds at what it's trying to do. There's certainly a few parts of this game that feel unnecessary and not properly fleshed out, and it does run the risk of feeling a little bit repetitive towards the end, not to mention the save file in this game takes up half a PlayStation memory card, which is the cost of being able to design and save your own layer, I suppose. But regardless, there's so many cool and unique ideas in this game that it's kind of hard not to respect it in a way. I mean, I've played games that are kind of like this before. It actually reminds me a bit of games like Night Trap and even Ghostmaster to a degree, but I don't think I've played a game from this era that is simultaneously this funny and also this sadistic. And while the series' first entry here is certainly quite primitive and most definitely an acquired taste, it's also easily one of the silliest and most memorable games that I have played in any of these volumes, that's for sure. Now earlier on, I said this game is kind of the black sheep of the franchise, and the reason for this is that the next game in the series, Kagero Deception 2, which is also on the PS1, changed the gameplay into a third-person title, which now focuses on performing trap combos, essentially getting invaders caught in a Rube Goldberg-style series of traps to score big points, and every subsequent Deception game from this point on would build on this style, as well as continue to add more and more waifus as well, meaning the first Deception is really kind of its own thing when compared to the rest of the series. And as much as I'd like to buy a copy of it to show off at my cats, it is unfortunately rather expensive to buy nowadays. But thankfully, most of the later entries in the series aren't all that expensive, so don't worry, we still have some relevant cat footage, and I suppose if you want to check the series out and not break the bank, these entries would be my recommendation for newcomers. But if you have the means to play it and are in the mood for a spooky and very dumb time, the original Deception is still like nothing else on the console and is something I think everybody should try at least once. Seriously, if you haven't murdered somebody with a giant foot Monty Python style, you should really get on that ASAP.
you will provide.
Next up, we have an odd game with an even odder name. It's PO'd, which either stands for pissed off or pissed off de, I guess. A very bizarre first-person shooter about a chef that fights aliens, which made its way to the PlayStation in the summer of 1996. This game was chosen for us today by Baku Danashita, and let me tell you, this game falls nicely into two of my favorite categories: console-exclusive first-person shooters and ports of Trilogy games that made it over to the PlayStation. That's right, PO'd here originally launched on the Trilogy all the way back in 1995. This game was the product of an American dev studio by the name of Any Channel, a company with pretty much no footprint online whatsoever. According to Moby Games, the only other game they were involved in was the '98 PC title Vigilance, which apparently was the GoldenEye killer for home computers. But yeah, other than that, PO'd is pretty much Any Channel's only claim to fame. Now, I've kind of warmed to the idea of the Trilogy and its games over the years. Yeah, a lot of them aren't very good and oftentimes very janky, but there's a lot of creativity and, I don't know, a certain surrealness to its library. It kind of feels like the Ren and Stimpy of games consoles. I don't know if that makes much sense, but if you've played enough Trilogy games, it just might. Now, PO'd in particular always stood out to me as a prime example of a Trilogy-ass game. It's a genre you all know and love, but with a whole extra layer of crazy on top. Did I think it looked fun to play? Absolutely not. But did I think it looked interesting? Abso-fucking-lutely. So in a way, I'm actually pretty excited to play this PS1 port here today, which was also developed by Any Channel, and from what I've heard is the best version of the game available, so that's quite handy. Anyway, let's dive in and see if this bizarre mess of a game is actually any fun. Now, first things first, there is some story present here, but it is kept to an absolute bare minimum, as per classic FPS tradition. Our game takes place in a far-off sci-fi setting where we play as a fella called Ox, the chef aboard a mercenary vessel that has recently been raided by aliens, leaving you as the only member of the crew not dead or captured. And since help apparently won't arrive until 3 months from now, it's up to you to take your kitchen utensils and bonk your way to freedom, I suppose. If you're wondering about the enemies that you're seeing here, by the way, there is no explanation for this or any of the enemies in this game for that matter. We're just gonna have to go with the flow and avoid the walking ass monsters to the best of our abilities. Anyway, that's the last we'll see of the story until the end, so from here on out, it is pure gameplay, baby. Pure anxiety-inducing, trippy-ass gameplay. So, as usual, the controls will be quite familiar to anybody who's played a console FPS, or, I don't know, Tecmo's Deception, I suppose. D-pad to move and turn, shoulder buttons to strafe, and you've also got a handy jump button too. As for the shooting, well, you've got yourself a shoot button, and also there's a button to look up and down, although the game does have auto-aim, so you don't really need to worry too much about that. You can also swap between your various weapons by pressing the weapon select button, and then using L1 and R1 to cycle between your weapons, a process that, while functional, is a little bit laggy and awkward to do, especially if you're mid-combat. So far, this all seems pretty regular for an FPS of its day, but what if I told you PO'd is really a game that's defined by its more unique features and, style, I guess you could say, specifically regarding the player's movement. You see, when you kick things off in PO'd, you can actually change between two different movement types by pressing the select button. A slower, more normal run speed with precise movement, and a very fast, almost turbo stall mode where you can pick up momentum to help make much bigger jumps. The game very early on brings you to a level called Jump, which feels designed specifically to get you used to these movement options and how they tie into the game's level design. So I'm gonna let you know now, both these movement options feel terrible. You either get a really sluggish and slow basic walk speed, or one that's just way too fast and often sees you sliding off platforms and struggling to make even the most basic of movements. This combined with what is honestly some very awkward and even quite nauseating level design does not give this game a good first impression. Not to mention the early game weapons, which are pretty much just a frying pan and some butcher blades that you can throw infinitely, don't really paint the combat in a great light either. Enemies are plentiful, they're tanky, and they're also very, very aggressive. And look, don't even get me started on the flying enemies, who will be the bane of your existence throughout this game. Hard to kill, always in your way, and constantly throwing out projectiles. Like I said, 2 levels in, and the game already isn't leaving a great impression, let me tell you. But, and it's a big but, PO'd actually takes a pretty dramatic shift as the game progresses, as in the next level, I got access to a jetpack. A jetpack that you can both use to move around levels normally, replacing your standard movement, but also a jetpack that lets you freely fly around the game's levels. Once you have the jetpack, you can then swap between walking and flying movement at will, and similarly to walking, the jetpack also has a slower and turbo mode. The major difference is that the jump button now controls your jetpack, and by holding jump, you propel yourself upwards, and if you let go, you begin to descend. Simply just tapping the jump button mid-flight lets you freely hover, and yeah, that's pretty much all you need to know to start flying. Now, I'm not going to say the control on this jetpack is perfect by any means, but it felt like an immediate improvement to the game's movement and flow. And from there, the levels really started getting more elaborate, open-ended, and dare I say, massive in scale. So it soon becomes quite clear that this jetpack is really the thing that this game and its levels were designed around. And the moment that all clicks and you begin to treat it as this sort of weird jetpacking FPS game that really doesn't take itself too seriously, well, dare I say, it actually starts becoming quite fun. The game gives you these big open arenas to traverse around and blast enemies in, elaborately designed levels that take advantage of the jetpack gameplay to traverse maps and solve puzzles, and these levels are often so unusual and surreal, not just in a visual sense, but they can feature level-specific gimmicks and mission objectives that make it feel like no other FPS game out there. It can oftentimes be a lot to take in, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't confused a lot of the time. Sure, the goal is just to reach the teleporter at the end of the level, but the criteria for doing so can vary wildly from level to level, to the point where it feels like the devs are actively trolling you at times. It's game design that feels out there and experimental, even if it's not always necessarily what I'd call good. But hey, if you do end up getting lost or confused during a level, which you probably will, the game does have a pretty good 3D map that you can call up at any time, so don't be afraid to make use of it if the game ever leaves you scratching your head. And I'll tell you another thing that ends up being pretty good as the game goes on: the shooting, which as mentioned earlier, thanks to some weak and ineffective weapons, kinda sucks at the beginning of the game, but as the game goes on and you start adding more weapons to your roster that are usually found hidden throughout the game's levels, the combat also takes a shift and becomes quite satisfying too. The weapons in this game mostly fall into your usual FPS archetypes. You've got a pistol, some auto-fire weapons, a flamethrower, an energy weapon, and 2 different rocket launchers, one of which is a quick auto-fire rocket launcher, which is probably the game's best weapon, and another lets you steer your rockets from a first-person camera, which, let's be fair, is always a blast in any game that it appears in, and also very effective for killing enemies in this one too. I also think this might be one of the earliest examples of a weapon like this seen in a first-person shooter, so its implementation here in a console FPS is really quite impressive, all things considered. Unfortunately though, not all weapons are created equal. While the majority are quite strong and very satisfying to use, some by comparison are pretty weak against nearly every enemy in the game, like the flamethrower and energy cannon. And in the case of the energy cannon, its bullets deflect off walls, so they can also cause you a lot of hassle too. Also, this is another FPS that sorely lacks a shotgun of some sort, but I suppose the game does at least give us a drill, which has this fun screen clearing effect if things get a little too bloody, so that kinda makes up for it. Ammo, at least, is thankfully quite plentiful throughout the game, and also dropped by most of the game's enemies, and if you've got a keen eye, you can even find permanent capacity upgrades for your ammo limits and also your health, which, as you'd imagine, is quite useful. But all in all, the act of shooting the weird little aliens that block your path is pretty damn fun most of the time. Well, except for the flying ones, that is. Seriously, they're never not annoying. And I suppose, speaking of the enemies, yes, their designs are a definite highlight, or I guess lowlight, depending on how you view walking anuses. Although there isn't really a huge amount of variety in how you engage with them. All flying enemies are annoying, move quickly and have projectiles, except for the ones that suicide bomb you, which are even more annoying, while the ground enemies either rush you for damage or rush you and also throw projectiles at you, which thankfully are pretty easy to avoid with the old jetpack strafe combo. You see, while the level design is often quite clever and makes you think outside the box, the shooting portion of this game actually reminds me a little of Serious Sam in that it's straightforward and doesn't require much thought, but still gives you a nice little kick of adrenaline because there's a whole lot of enemies coming your way, and good news, it's pretty fun to shoot them. There's unfortunately no bosses per se, but the game does get you to shoot some really strange things as it goes on, and the last level has these terrifying fast moving spiders, so yeah, if you have arachnophobia, I guess this is the true final boss. Overall, the game has about 26 levels that are split across 3 different chapters. Well, at least I think they're chapters anyway. The way it works is that your ship is kind of the game's hub world, I guess, and within there, you have access to a teleporter that takes you to a series of levels. Once you're done with that series of levels, you then come back to the ship and you'll have access to a new teleporter, and you do it all over again. If you want to save mid-game, you can do so at any time by bringing up the pause menu as long as you've got a memory card, but the game is also nice enough to give you a password after every level as well. I should also highlight that there's 3 secret levels as well, and unfortunately, I only ever managed to find one, which was completely by accident, by the way. I genuinely have no idea how I got here, which honestly kind of seems on brand for a game like this. But my god, look at this thing. I know there's people out there that probably thinks this looks like ass, and yeah, I can respect that. I mean, it is literally a game full of ass, but seriously, this trippy, glitched out series of rooms that are vaguely attached to one another with creepy eyes staring at me. This is the 3DO, baby. Well, in PlayStation form, and I gotta say, I think it's actually pretty rad. So I suppose that gives us a nice segue to talk about the game's presentation and visuals, and look, there's clearly a lot to say about how this game looks, but first off, performance-wise, the game seems to run at a pretty consistent 18 FPS, which is about on par from most early console shooters, and while it's not ideal, it is quite stable, and surprisingly, if anything in this game was gonna make you throw up, the nicest thing I can say about it is that the frame rate probably won't be the culprit. The visuals, on the other hand, well, as you've clearly seen, they are most certainly something. I would say the vast majority of people out there will probably hate the way this game looks. It's glitchy, visually manic, the textures are incredibly bad at times, especially when you get up close. The whole thing can sometimes feel like a headache in video game form, and considering the complexity of some of this game's levels, there are plenty of times where you probably won't even be able to make out what you're looking at or where you can go. Thankfully, this isn't always the case, and it is something that you kind of get used to as the game goes on, but to say this game's visuals would be an acquired taste is an understatement. But in saying that, there's still something quite charming and appealing to its surreal visual elements that I think might actually make the game more appealing now than ever before, because people really love a bizarre ass PlayStation game, right? And people also love a bizarre ass first person shooter. I know I do anyway. And I think PO just kind of ticks a lot of those boxes for me. I mean, it's a rare game that gives you a jetpack and lets you just fly around these spaces having a silly old time while your brain struggles to process the nightmarish visuals that you're seeing in front of you. I mean, that's gotta be appealing to some of you, right? Although when it comes to sound, I'd say this is where PO drops the ball the hardest. On one hand, the game has practically no music whatsoever, which, you know, kinda sucks, but I can live without it if I have to. But what makes it worse is that the sound effects you're left with are oftentimes very grating and, at worst, obnoxiously loud. It's weird, right? Because some of the sound effects I'd honestly say are quite good and very punchy, and a big part of what makes some of the weapons in this game so satisfying to use But on the other hand, they can sometimes be so bad that it will turn you off using a weapon entirely. I don't know if this issue is the same in the 3DO version of the game, but if so, it really does feel like sound as a whole wasn't given that much attention in this game and does more to actively hurt it than help it, which is really quite sad to see, or hear, I guess. So yeah, that's a look at PO'd, and truthfully, this game leaves one of the worst first impressions that I've ever had with a video game, but then somehow goes on to be a rather unique and enjoyable FPS when all is said and done. The game's trademark jetpack movement, combined with some satisfying shooting, plenty of weird enemies to blow up, and some very unique level and visual design, make this a diamond in the rough, I'd say. Well, maybe not a diamond, more like an emerald in the rough. Not quite amazing, but if you dig through the dirt, you might still end up pretty pleased with what you find. My one recommendation to you though is that if you do decide to play this, try the game on easy mode first, as normal and hard are both very difficult and limit your jetpack fuel, whereas easy mode not only feels more balanced difficulty wise, but also gives you infinite jetpack fuel, and I can really not stress enough how much better this game is with infinite jetpack fuel. What can I say, being a flying psychopathic space chef just never gets old. So as far as PlayStation FPS games go, PO'd is certainly a niche pick nowadays, and there are certainly plenty of better rounded and more polished titles that you could opt for instead, but if you think you can stomach its visuals and aesthetic, it's a very unique game, and one that I think might end up surprising a lot of you, assuming you can make it past the second level, that is. Seriously, that is easier said than done.
You will provide.
Rounding things out today, we have Destrega, a cool fighting game all about shooting lasers at each other that first made its way to Japan in 1998 before later seeing a Western release in 1999. This game was chosen for us today by Teo Zurich, and in many ways this ties in quite nicely with an earlier game from this episode, because this time around we have a game from Japanese developer Koei, who you might remember as the company that eventually merged with Deception developer Tecmo. See? That's convenient. Although, the most interesting thing about Destrega is that it's an early release from a developer called Omega Force, who you are probably no doubt familiar with thanks to the much loved Dynasty Warriors series and the many other Musou variants out there. Seriously though, Dynasty Warriors is so good. It's one of the most primal video game experiences out there, just mashing buttons and taking out whole armies to some fantastic music. Sometimes you can even ride an elephant. what more could you want? Now, before Omega Force kind of found their niche with these hack and slash genocide simulators, they actually dabbled in a few different genres, including the cover shooter Winback on the N64, the Japan-only PS1 adventure title Enigma, and most notably the very first Dynasty Warriors title, which isn't just Omega Force's first ever game, but a 1v1 weapons-based fighter at that. You know, something interesting about the Dynasty Warriors series is that in Japan, the series we generally know as Dynasty Warriors is actually a spin-off of this fighting game, meaning the series got a whole new name starting from what we know as Dynasty Warriors 2. So this means every numbered Dynasty Warriors entry is actually a number behind in Japan. So when we got Dynasty Warriors 9, for example, they got Dynasty Warriors 8. It's quite funny when you think about it. Anyway, not long after the original Dynasty Warriors, Omega Force would try their hand at another fighting game, one that is very different to the one that came before it. Destrega here forgoes the Three Kingdoms and instead places us in a medieval fantasy setting where all our fighting takes place within these open arenas, and instead of getting up close and personal with our foes, the fighting instead focuses on firing a variety of ranged magic attacks at our opponents. There is still some close quarters fighting, by the way, which, to be fair, is pretty important to the combat overall, but come on, look at all this cool shit I can fire at my opponents. This is what Destrega's all about. Now, full disclosure, this is a game I had played before, albeit a very, very long time ago. It's one of those nostalgic childhood favorites that a friend in school introduced me to. We'd usually talk about video games on our lunch break, and one day he brought me in a demo disc and told me to check out a game called Destrega, said it would be right up my alley, and turns out, he was right. Eventually, the guy would purchase the full version of the game and then give me a lend of it, and I pretty much played it non-stop over a single weekend. I gave it back to him, and then that was the last I ever played of Destrega for, I don't know, about 20 or so years. It's rarely a game that I would hear get brought up over the years, but if you ever meet someone who's played Destrega, they're almost always like, alright, Destrega. So on a personal level, I'm quite looking forward to diving back into Destrega and seeing how it holds up all these years later. Is it as fun as I remember, or was I just a dumb kid extremely pleased by shooting lasers at people? Probably the latter, but hey, let's find out. Now, I suppose to kick things off, we should first explain the gameplay of Destrega, which at its core is a pretty straightforward arena fighter, one of the earliest examples of the genre actually, but I suppose the big gimmick here is the ranged elements of the combat, which is what really sets it apart from its contemporaries. You run around a little arena firing projectiles at your opponent, and then they'll probably fire some at you. If you get too close to one another, you can then engage in hand-to-hand combat. Once you knock a few lumps out of each other, whoever is left standing at the end of the round, well then they're the winner. Pretty basic stuff really. If you've ever played Psychic Force, it's basically just that, but in fantasy arena form. But Sean, I hear you ask, how do you shoot these magic bolts at your opponent? Well, the answer is thankfully quite easily. In Destrega, we have access to 3 different attack buttons, and each of these buttons activates a different type of magic attack, known in this game as Beto, Est, and Foe. Although an easier way to describe these would be your fast attack, your heavy attack, and your wide attack. Press square for a fast magic attack, triangle for a slower, stronger one, and circle for one that focuses on covering a wider area. Pretty straightforward, right? Each character has their own unique range of magic attacks that sets them apart from one another, but really all you need to know is the difference between fast, heavy, and wide attacks, and there you go, you can pretty much play everybody. Once you move in close for hand-to-hand combat, the same rules apply again. Square is a fast attack that can combo, triangle is a heavy attack and combo ender, and circle, instead of a wide attack, is now an evasive attack that can counter heavy attacks. It's basically a rock, paper, scissors system. Beyond that, you can also jump, which is quite handy for both traversing the arenas as well as doing cool aerial attacks, and you can also guard and dash briefly by using the shoulder buttons, and yeah, that's pretty much all you need to know. Of course, we are yet to mention Destrega's most important gameplay feature, which is the charge system. You see, when you press an attack button, you briefly enter a charge animation before launching your attack. If you press another attack during this charge window, you will increase your attack strength, and you can do this up to 3 times, essentially tripling the effectiveness of your spell. What was once a lowly speed attack is now a deadly fast bolt of energy if you manage to charge it up 3 times. And better still, you can actually combine the attributes of your other spells. You can do fast, strong, strong, wide, fast, fast, strong, strong, wide, there's quite literally a ton of different combinations and unique spells at your disposal, and casting them is as simple as pressing a few different buttons. You can even do a super ability by adding one of each spell type to your attack. It is very powerful, but leaves you very vulnerable if things go wrong. Of course though, you can't simply cast these spells at will. That would be a little bit too easy. You are going to need some stamina, which you can track using the meter below your health bar. This charges up automatically during fights, and each level of your magic reduces it by a certain amount. So if you want to cast the big spells, you're going to have to be both patient and evasive to make it work. Now, charging isn't just used for your attacks, it can also affect your basic abilities as well. If you charge before a block, for example, it activates a power shield that blocks all damage but drains your stamina while active. If you press charge before a dash, you can then deflect same level magic attacks and catch your opponent off guard for a combo. And best of all, if you charge before a jump, you enter this sort of auto-fire state where you can briefly set off a barrage of spells if you input them very, very quickly. The spells in this mode are a little bit weaker, but they can very easily overwhelm an opponent that's busy charging up a big, strong attack. You see, this is kind of the big draw of Destrega's combat. It's quite simple and easy to get into, but the fun of it comes from outsmarting your opponent through positioning and quick thinking. I mean, you probably could just pick up this game and mash a load of buttons and cool stuff will happen, but if you wanted to play this game seriously, I think there's enough cool tech here to make for some pretty hype and intense battles. I know I at least experienced quite a few of them while playing through this thing. Anyway, that's about it for the gameplay, so why don't we take a look at the modes on offer, which you'll be happy to hear are quite generous. We've got the usual fighting game staples like one-player battle mode, which is basically the game's arcade mode. It's quite standard with a little points ranking at the end, but unfortunately it has no character cutscenes, although you will see why in a moment. There's also a training mode, versus mode, a nice survival mode, and even a team battle mode, which we love to see. In fact, the menu and UI in this game remind me a little bit of Tekken 2 actually, which certainly ain't a bad thing. You can even watch a little tutorial video if you like, which is almost certainly a better way of learning the game than having me explain it to you. So overall, a decent selection of modes, but the real star of the show has to be the game's story mode, which is a nice bite-sized romp through the world of Destrega, packed full of fighting, action, and more importantly, a large number of fully voiced cutscenes that manage to straddle the line between charmingly bad and also at times surprisingly good. Well, at least for a PS1 fighting game anyway.
Since only the Destrega can stop him, Zauber has been hunting us down, eliminating us, and anyone else that stands in his way.
You will join us, yes?
No way.
What? But why?
I don't care about some duty I know nothing about.
The story ends up being pretty engaging actually, and offers some nice backstory to the world and its characters, and I suppose why they all fire crazy magic at one another, but more importantly, it does a really good job at defining the characters and their personalities, because I'm not going to lie to you, while I actually quite like the majority of the character designs in this game, they certainly aren't the most memorable bunch to look at, are they? But if you play through story mode, you'll go from thinking, hey look, it's Doyle, to holy shit, it's Doyle. This guy is the best.
I'm through fighting.
I don't believe this guy.
You see, I tend to gravitate towards characters in fighting games if I know their backstories, their motivations, and their personalities. It's part of the reason I love fighting game openings and ending cutscenes so much, that and they're, really funny. But the story mode does a great job at doing that for this game's cast, while also giving you an interesting story to follow, as well as a bunch of fights in between, which is always nice. It takes roughly about 90 minutes or so to get through if you're watching all the cutscenes, and while it is a pretty good time, unfortunately it is very much a one and done kind of experience, and worse still, you don't actually get anything for beating it, except the satisfaction of spending more time with Doyle, I suppose. In fact, unusually, this game doesn't have a single secret character to unlock, which was kind of the thing for fighting games back then, right? Well, don't you worry, because we have something slightly different instead, which is almost as good. You see, if you beat one player battle mode with a character and then highlight that character and press R2 when selecting them, the character will now have a Dynasty Warriors skin from the very first game. So you can play as all your favorites like Zhang Fei, Lu Bu, Cao Cao, even Zushu, but now with the voice of a small girl for some reason. See? That's kind of weird. Anyway, I think we've covered all the game's modes and features, so why don't we talk about the presentation, which honestly is kind of a mixed bag. On the visual side of things, Destrega is actually quite impressive in some parts, specifically the magic and spell effects, which nearly always look amazing. I especially love Angie's spells, which are just different versions of the PlayStation face buttons, a really lovely little touch. And to be fair to Omega Force, the character models do look quite good both while far away and up close, and if you remember back to Bloodlines, another game with a similar look, that certainly wasn't the case there. But that being said, I can't help but feel that Destrega also has a very boring and kind of bland vibe prevalent across the game. I get that the setting is meant to represent a pretty grounded and realistic fantasy style, minus all the magic of course, but the arenas are just so bland throughout this game. There's quite a lot of them, mind you, and I do appreciate that they offer different elevations and hiding spots to make the gameplay a little more dynamic, but they're just kind of boring to look at, and also boring to, I don't know, just exist in. I suppose it doesn't really matter all that much since it's all this cool action that you're going to be focusing on, but I think it kind of does the game a disservice overall. It's technically proficient and runs well, but you know, it's just kinda boring. The music and sound thankfully fare a bit better. Now, we've already mentioned the voice acting, which is still PS1 levels of jank for the most part, but there's definitely some good, well-recorded voice work in here that definitely deserves to be praised, and the combat and sound effects also sound on point too. Hard-hitting, punchy, and full of pew-pew magic effects, just like you'd hope. Although, the music, while decent and serviceable overall, is largely forgettable in my opinion. There's some nice tracks during the fights, but nothing that really stood out and grabbed me, which is disappointing when you consider how good Omega Force's music generally is. They were even popping off in the original Dynasty Warriors, if you can believe it. Although I would like to point out that there are some soundtrack highlights that are exclusive to the story mode, which mostly comes down to how strange and out of place they feel. Like, the last thing I was expecting in a scene like this was 70s car chase music, but hey, if it's good, I'll take it.
Stand aside! Let me handle this.
You!
Move it!
Huh.
Anyway, I think that about does it for our look at Destrega, and I suppose that begs the question, is this game as good as I remembered it? And to that, I would say yes, it's actually exactly as good as I remembered it, which is to say it's a really fun game for a couple of hours at least. Destrega is immediately satisfying pick up and play action at its finest. Honestly, there are few fighting games out there that let you do so much cool stuff so easily, and really that's kind of its downfall in a way too. While there is undoubtedly some technical depth to its combat that can allow for some really intense and dramatic fights, it's something you can master very quickly, and considering all the game's characters effectively share the same movesets, well, you can feel like you've seen all the game has to offer quite quickly. Sure, the magic effects are different from character to character, but functionally, most of them are just recolors of the same spells. You throw in a very small amount of unlockable content, and well, this means Destrega is a game that I can't see most playing for more than a few hours before eventually shelving it. It will be a really fun couple of hours, no doubt, and I'm sure for most, that'll be more than enough to get you to try it, but if complexity and longevity are what you're after with your fighting game, well, Destrega is not the game for you. But if you like mashing buttons and shooting lasers, however, this is very much the game for you. In fact, this whole engine seems like it would have been perfect for for a Dragon Ball fighting game, and God knows the PS1 needed a good Dragon Ball fighting game. Now, if you do want to pick up a physical copy of Destrega, this is yet another title that has ended up quite rare and expensive nowadays. But hey, look, even with my issues, this is still one of the coolest games that I ever beat over a single weekend. And look, if you've got a weekend free coming up, well then I think you'll have a pretty good time with Destrega, even now in 2023. Especially if you like cosplaying as Donnie Sawyer's characters, and come on, that's gotta be some of you.
Get lost!
Well, there you go, that's another volume of obscure and forgotten PS1 games coming to a close. One of the more eclectic lineups of games we've had, I think. But look, any video that's full of funny trap deaths has to be worthwhile, right? We got to check out a top-down racer that has a little more, bite, a game that shows if you pledge your soul to the devil, you might get a nice house out of it. A strange chef-based shooter that I wish had a Gordon Ramsay mod, and finally, the best Dragon Ball game on the PlayStation, only instead you can play as Lu Bu. A fun mix of video games for sure, but how did they rank on the all-important arbitrary ranking system? Are any of the games must-plays? Are they worth trying if you like the look of them? Did I think they were just kinda meh? Or are they so bad that they end up in the most dishonorable tier of all, the trash tier? Well, today's episode, if you can believe it, sees all our games, Micromaniacs, Deception, PO'd, and Destrega, making their way into Tri-tier. How exciting. Pretty much all of today's games fall under the same category, which is to say that they're all rather enjoyable games, but with some pretty noticeable flaws, some of which have bigger flaws than others for sure, and I'm sure you can guess which one, but each game strikes me as one that somebody out there could really quite love because of their unique elements, and in some cases, entirely unique gameplay styles. They, of course, won't be for everybody, but I'd feel confident in saying that if any of the games highlighted today seem like they're up your alley, well then they probably are, and as long as you can live with a few hiccups along the way, well then you might even end up finding a new favorite worth adding to your collection. Yes, even PO'd. Seriously, it's not great, but it is probably better than you think. Anyway, before we finish up, I'd like to say a big congrats to the wheels chosen for this episode. So, give it up for Kaiser Cantu for Micromaniacs, the Four Horsemen of Enikororo, Julius Engels Greer III, Mr. Becker and Mako Powered Gaming for Deception, Baku Danashida for PO'd, and finally Tio Zurich for Destrega. A big thank you for your contribution to the video, and I really hope you enjoyed the episode. And of course, episodes like this wouldn't be possible without the lovely support of my Patreon subscribers, some of which you can see before you now, including fine folk like Alan Caslin, Bloody Cassie, Callow Mello, Crimson Cyclist, Dave Nolan, Disc Kun, the mascot for the Famicom Disk System, Doma, Globe99, James Lovat, Kyle Winter, Matt Graham, Moomin Biscuit, Trans Rights Are Human Rights, Mr. the Joshmon, Nathan McMullen, Richard Kramer, SN Kersted, and Spectre117, who have all subscribed at the Fan++ tier. Many thanks, as always, for all your support. And finally, a big thank you to all of you wherever you are for watching this video. I'll be back real soon with some more PS1 content, but until then, take care, and don't forget, if you pay me €20, I will highlight your Turkish delight on the channel. Thank you, and good night.